I guess before we start, I'm Zian, and I cover energy and trade for Politico in Canada. It's obviously been very slow. No, it's not. It's been super busy since I started last 2 years, and it's never a dull moment, and I'm sure these two can also say the exact same thing. You have your microphones? Yes. All good. All right, so let's get into this discussion about international trade and your roles solving the world's problems. No pressure. So I guess I want to start off by weaving in the title of this panel, Inside the Splintering of International Trade. I can't help from my previous linguistics background to clock that slightly has a little pejorative sense to it. And I just wanted to get a sense from both of you. Let's start with Ambassador Theodore. Maybe you can start us off. You told Policy magazine in December that from your perspective, the role of trade is actually intensifying, and how that's a good thing. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I like that first question in terms of, what language means when we talk about trade and the role of trade. And when I did the interview with Policy magazine, my point was just to remind people that there are points in time when we are talking about the trajectory of global economic governance and the multilateral trading system in particular. And to me, it's not about whether something is splintering or whether something is devolving. It's really about the evolution of the trading system and what it means in particular for Canada, but what it means for our relationships with other countries. Trade is indeed expected to increase. That is a fact. And I think it's really more about figuring out how the changing nature of trade becomes an opportunity for Canada and for our businesses. And so that's really what I meant when I made the reference to trade intensifying.
Ambassador McKay, any thoughts to add on to that?
In terms of the intensification of trade, undoubtedly trade is going to go up. The world, in spite of its geopolitical tensions and recent supply chain disruptions, economies are growing, particularly in the region of the world that I'm most involved in. Middle class is growing, economies are growing, trade will intensify, and the complications of geopolitical tensions will undoubtedly have a significant impact on that.
I know some of you weren't here, I guess, at the beginning of the day, but at the beginning of the day, Janice Stein mentioned that competition, it's back with a vengeance, which is very attention-grabby. So that panel addressed the issue of securitization, which is, if you take its political science kind of definition of it, it's basically the process of taking state actors, turning political issues into matters of national security, and maybe, in effect, bringing disproportionate attention to an issue. So we see that with mining currently and the discussion around critical minerals, and we see this in the form of that new one-year Canada-US Energy Transformation Task Force as well, putting this as a priority. That's the one that's headed by Chrystia Freeland and Amos Hochstein. That's the group that's supposed to fuel momentum behind this net zero industrial push. So I guess my question to you two, what are areas that you're seeing a more robust discussion around securitization in relation to international trade? And are there conversations about de-securitization that you're also hearing as well?
Who's first? Look, I mean, in terms of, you raise critical minerals and some of the other very sensitive parts of global trade right now. The relationship that Canada has with Japan on the trade front has changed dramatically in the past few years, and not for very good reasons. Canada and Japan have been terrific partners, allies, friends for the 95 years we've had diplomatic relationship. And we've had good, consistent trade. The difference that has arisen certainly since February 24th of last year, certainly since China's more aggressive behavior in the Taiwan Strait, the South and East China Sea, is that Japan is more vulnerable than they've ever been on an economic security perspective. And economic security means food security and energy security, security of critical minerals, critical technologies. And thankfully, Canada has an answer to all of those security issues that Japan has. And so the lens through which Japan is viewing Canada over the past sort of 2 or 3 years has changed dramatically. And so they are looking at us to be reliable, sustainable partners of cleaner and newer energy projects. They're looking at us to be a reliable and more robust partner for agricultural exports. And most recently, they are very involved in the ecosystem of critical minerals, battery EV supply chains, where Canada, I think, is going to be a global hub. So Japan is really putting on the gas, spending enormous amounts of time in Canada, and soon enormous amounts of investment capital, both in infrastructure for ag, energy, and critical minerals.
And it's so fascinating to me because, so Ian spoke, particularly about Japan, but when you zoom out that narrative around what Canada can bring to Japan and what Japan is looking for, in particular in the context of securitizing trade, when you zoom out to the multilateral context, or even to the plurilateral context, when you're talking about the trading system, it's a similar conversation and it's a similar narrative, right? Which is that when we're talking about where trade is going in the context of, more contentious geopolitical realities and the need to use trade as part of a triangulation of national security, climate security, food security, the idea that when we are reaching out to partners around the globe, it's about understanding what products and what, we mentioned critical minerals. You can also talk about semiconductors, for example. So what are the areas where Canada and our allies understand that we will need to build close partnerships and have a little bit more of a tighter supply chain with regards to those critical products, understanding that we can't make everything by ourselves and that we need to have partnerships, but those partnerships need to be thought about a little bit more intentionally and in the broader context of geopolitical realities. And I think it's also important to realize that it's not going to be the same in every sector and with every country, right? And so it is very much, when I think about the securitization of trade, it's usually a broad brush that we paint it with, but it is actually quite varied and quite unique depending on the sector that we're talking about and depending on the relationships that we're talking about.
So let's stay on this multilateral context here, because we've went through a period of, I would say, intense trade deal negotiations, and right now we have, come out the other end with CETA, a renegotiated NAFTA, CPTPP as well. So from your perspectives, what are the headwinds that you see for Canada's role in fully implementing, I guess, these deals? Internal and external.
Well, listen, I think, so this is the thing. I think it's really important to realize, and in particular in this room, many of you will be very sympathetic to this view, I hope, that when we negotiate these trade deals, so you mentioned TPP and then CPTPP, it'll always be TPP for me because I was one of the deputy chief negotiators, and so it holds a special place in my heart. CETA and a range of other bilateral negotiations that we have concluded. We conclude them for a reason. Yes, they are legal texts, but the idea is then our companies go out and use those rules that we have negotiated, that stable, predictable environment that the rules create vis-a-vis our partners around the world in order to do business, in order to grow their business, which then grows the economy back home and brings jobs to Canada, coupled with the domestic environment that we need to make sure that those benefits are spread appropriately, right? And so I think that your question is a very relevant one, because we can quickly get into the habit of only keeping our eye out for that next big trade deal without realizing that the work that goes into the aftercare in marrying up the rules with businesses is super important. And I think that Canada for several years has really doubled down on this idea of aftercare. Ian can talk to that. I mean, he's got an incredible team in Japan whose job it is to do just that. When I was Consul General to the Southeast United States, based in Atlanta, I had a team that was, charged with doing that. And so I think that, Canada really is trying to understand the unique opportunity that businesses can yield with these trade agreements, and providing them with the practical tools and the practical expertise around the world to help them to link those opportunities up into their businesses.
Yeah, can I scoot in there and just pick up on your emphasis on rules, because it obviously makes me think about the WTO as well. We hear a lot of politicians from democratic countries advocate for this rules-based international order. So it's a good segue to talk about the World Trade Organization. The United States, effectively killed the appellate body during the Trump administration, and blocked, by blocking new members to the panel. But last June, the WTO members, including the United States, agreed to have a fully and well-functioning dispute settlement system by 2024. So, sorry, I gotta put you on the spot again. Take us inside the green room at the WTO and in the dining rooms of Geneva. Are you hopeful that this, fully and well-functioning dispute settlement system will be in place by 2024?
Well, listen, let me back up a little bit and say a couple of things. First, I think it's important to realize that the United States' issues with regards to the dispute settlement system at the World Trade Organization and the appellate body in particular are not new issues, right? They are issues that were brought up when I was in my first posting, over almost 15 years ago at the WTO, and remain today. Absolutely. There are other countries, Canada included, frankly, that agree that certain changes need to be made to the appellate body, to the dispute settlement system to make it better. 100%. I think that what's most interesting for all of us in this room that aren't as interested in the intricacies of dispute settlement at the World Trade Organization is to understand a couple of things when we talk about hopefulness with regards to any particular system, and the dispute settlement system can be an example. It's this, that there is no doubt that domestic realities in the United States and in many countries, and the geopolitical tensions that Ian very well talked about at the beginning, absolutely will be roadblocks to us as we try and reach convergence in multilateral settings on any issue. Not just trade issues, but across the multilateral world, coming to convergence on issues is becoming increasingly difficult. That's no doubt. What Canada has done, frankly, and I have to underscore this because indeed it was a Canada-led, together with the EU project, is create what we call the MPIA, the Multi-Party Interim Arrangement, which is a way to resolve disputes whether or not the appellate body is functioning. And I think that that's the most important piece. So we're using the dispute settlement system, to me, as an example to just say that I remain hopeful that regardless of what happens in 2024 with regards to the dispute settlement system, and even more broadly when we talk about international trade or any other multilateral issue that we're trying to deal with, that Canada, along with like-minded parties, is really at the table coming up with solutions that will allow us to continue to use the system in a way that works for us and to benefit from the system in a way that works for us, regardless if it's not reverting back to what we had before.
So wait and see approach. Ambassador McKay, I wanted to bring you back into this conversation. You kind of talked about this before, but I wanted to ask you in a very a sharply worded question in a way. What does Japan want that Canada has?
Well, we've got a lot of what Japan wants and what Japan needs. And again, the vulnerability that Japan has as a major, and they're the third largest economy in the world, they only produce 35% of the calories they consume. They import 90% of their energy. And so when and they have no critical minerals whatsoever under the ground. And so whenever there are geopolitical tensions, supply chain disruptions, they look to their friends, they look to who's been the most reliable, steady, trusted partner on their trade frameworks, and they're coming to Canada. And so about 4 years ago, Japan said, we really need more propane gas, because that's how a lot of the households in Japan, fulfill their heating requirements. So 4 years ago, Canada started for the first time ever exporting LPG, liquefied propane gas, to Japan, all sourced in Alberta, all sent through newly created infrastructure to the West Coast. And we're now Japan's #1 supplier of LPG. It's about $2 billion a year of exports. So this happened very quickly, and is real testament to why Japan looks to Canada when they have these emerging needs. The LNG Canada project, which of course is the biggest LNG project on the planet, will be delivered not just on time, but before schedule, probably starting next summer. And that will be delivering up to 30 million tons of LNG to Japan and other partners in the region. The reason this is important for Japan is because they are, as committed as they are to 2030 and 2050 net zero targets, they require transitional fuel to get them off coal, because their nuclear power capacity has been diminished significantly since the Fukushima disaster of 12 years ago. So again, they look to Canada, and Canada stepped up and will become their #1 supplier of LNG as well. Agriculture is the same story. When the Russian invasion happened, Japan, of course, supported very full-throatedly all of the sanctions that the G7 put forth. And this was the first time, by the way, that Japan actually imposed and followed through on sanctions during these global crises. It cut off a lot of their agriculture imports from Russia. So again, Canada stepped up, and our ag imports are up about 20% year over year. So these are really critical, specific, real-time files where the two countries are working very, very well together. And thankfully for the TPP, the CPTPP, there is a framework in place to expedite the export of those products to Japan. It's been a real terrific trade deal.
We have just under 5 minutes left, so I'm just squeezing 2 more questions. So this one, there's a lot of talk among G7 countries specifically about partnering up with reliable countries, reliable partners. To your knowledge, is there kind of a common standardized rubric for what is or is not a reliable partner?
A reliable partner, certainly from the view of our Indo-Pacific partners, is a partner who, even during COVID, when supply chains were disrupted for a variety of reasons, even during wartime geopolitical tensions, a reliable partner is those that honor their trade commitments, and is a country whose exporters, the private sector, honor their contractual commitments with the host country. And Canada has performed exceedingly well on both those points. The next phase, as I referenced earlier, is Japan will be an extraordinarily big player in the EV battery supply chain ecosystem. Up until about 6 months ago, they were quite happy to source a lot of their minerals and their battery processing capacity in China. And while I would never use the word decoupling, I think Japan has taken the view that they're going to diversify and bring much of that investment capital, much of that infrastructure to Canada, where they will build mining capacity, processing capacity, battery manufacturing capacity, and ultimately EV manufacturing platforms. There will be new platforms to build the EV vehicles, right up to the recycling of the batteries. So we are benefiting from, again, some rather unfortunate circumstances in the global economy, but it takes a trusted 95-year relationship for those things to happen as quickly as they're happening.
Master Theodore, you have anything to add?
No, everything that Ian said.
All right. Then I think we can end with this fun, light question. This is your moment of levity today, right now. So last question to wrap things up before our audience is treated to a rich discussion in the next panel, probing Canada's industrial policy. Since you two are our only headlining ambassadors at the summit, are you watching The Diplomat? And what are your thoughts on it?
I'm not watching The Diplomat, but I will because you are now number 7, the 7th person to say to me, are you watching The Diplomat? You have to watch it. And so it is now officially on my list of must-watch TV shows.
So I recently got a new role to pile on top of my day job in Japan as special advisor to the Indo-Pacific. And so
you're a double diplomat.
The question of what I do with my spare time is no longer really relevant. However, I did watch the first episode of The Diplomat, and I plan to watch the rest of it, but then Succession Season 4 came out, and I couldn't, I had to pivot. I had to pivot quickly, because time is so precious. So once I get through Succession, it'll be back to Diplomat.
Another show that I have not yet watched. We're very well
on
behind.
that.
I know.
All that pesky work.
Right.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Master Theodore,
Thank you.
Master McKay.